Believe it or not, I'm talking about corn. My name's Jake Wilson. I'm a master's student from Iowa State in agricultural engineering. You've heard a lot today about the four R's. I'm not a big fan of the four R's because each R is right, and I don't think it's very memorable. But I will be talking about something similar, and that's nitrogen application timing. And so I'll be talking about that from a sustainability perspective and an economic perspective. So a little outline of what we'll be talking about. Nitrogen loss pathway, which is the key to all of this, and it's why we're losing nitrogen in the field, and we have a timing effect. Some of the timing options we'll go through, and then a little literature review that I did of nitrogen response by season. We'll have the economic side of that. We'll talk about precipitation and how that affects your timing, or how your timing will affect the precipitation effects will have on your timing. And then we'll have some of the side dress application challenges and some tools that we can use to help get around those challenges. And finally, we'll touch a little bit on greenhouse gas abatement. So first, nitrogen loss pathways. These are the main pathways that you're going to lose nitrogen by. Denitrification and volatilization, both losses to the atmosphere. And so nitrogen is sitting in wet, warm soil. If you're surface applying on open fields, you're going to have volatilization because that ammonium is going to turn into ammonia and be lost to the air. Now, leaching is one thing that we're worried about, especially in Iowa with a lot of our eutrophication issues. And so that's when we're releasing our soil nitrate through the water or through the soil by way of water, and it's going into our waterways, which has a negative effect. So we want to look at how we can limit these pathways so that we can have the big green one up in the middle of plant uptake, which is our main goal. So our options for timing pretty much come down to this. You have fall, spring, and an in-season side dress application. Now, in Iowa, we have about 50 million pigs that are raised every year, and with that, there's a lot of manure that needs to be applied. Now, fall is the most common season for us to apply that manure, typically because there's dry field conditions. It's after harvest, so you don't really have quite as busy of a schedule, and that's really what the main people do there. But some people are starting to shift towards a spring application, which limits the exposure that that nitrogen has to the rain events and to that the early fall denitrification losses. Now, there are some challenges with spring applications because you have wet field conditions, or you can have wet field conditions, and it's already the planting season, and plenty of people in Iowa get pushed back in their planting season due to weather. Now, if you have to apply nitrogen at the same time, extra challenges. So a third option is a side dress application. And this is really the best way to minimize the time that the nitrogen is spending in the field and really limiting the exposure to those conditions where it'll be lost so you can spoon feed it right as the crop needs arise. Now, usually this side dress application is limited to before the V4 phase of corn growth, and that's because a lot of the equipment that we fields for side dress can cause damage to the corn when it's. Now, I did a literature review for 65 site years of data that was corn grown in North America using 2 or more application seasons and 3 or more nitrogen rates. And I looked to fit those to curves so that we can see really how significant are these differences between application seasons. Now, a lot of this data ranged from 1960 all the way to about present day. And so with the changing trendline yield, we had to normalize it. So I decided to normalize it to be relative to the maximum yield in that site here. Now, a long-term study from the University of Minnesota was especially helpful because in the same location and can correlate that with rainfall data and application timings. So this is what we found. As you can see at first, there's a whole lot of variation, and that's inherent in the world of agriculture. But once we see that fall application was the least, and the yield was best in these side dress applications. And so limiting the amount of time that that nitrogen was sitting in the fields was most effective. Now, at about 200 pounds per acre of nitrogen, you can see a fall application might get you 90% of your maximum yield. So in a 200 bushel system, you might be getting 180 bushels per acre. Now, just shifting that application to a spring or a side dress application can probably push you up to an extra 10 bushels a year, which at $4 a bushel, $40 an acre is not bad. You can also see that this curve starts to level off towards the top. And that really comes into an economic question of when is the point that you should stop applying nitrogen? When is your increase in yield so little that it doesn't make sense to pay for more nitrogen? So we did that analysis next. And this is what we found. A fall application. So this is a maximum return to nitrogen. You might be familiar with MRTN. This is a baseline that a lot of people might use to fertilize their corn. The tool that's available right now online does not incorporate season, and so we wanted to incorporate season into that tool and see how seasonality affected really what your economic optimum nitrogen rate is. Now, fall application, as you can see, has the highest economic optimum nitrogen rate while still yielding the lowest. So you can put on 220 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the fall and still only have a yield of 191 bushels with these assumptions. So it's pretty reliant on the corn prices, the nitrogen prices, and in our case, the maximum yield since I was using the relative yield. But in our 200 bushel per acre system, your fall application, you have to put on the most nitrogen while still yielding the least. Now, if you just switch to a side dress application, you only need to put on 166 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and you can still yield higher than you would have otherwise. And this comes down to nitrogen efficiency. So really, by shifting from a fall to a side dress application, you're really getting the most bang for your buck out of your nitrogen. And I think that's really the key takeaway, especially for perspective. We want to see better nitrogen use efficiency because that means we're not losing our nitrogen to our waterways, and we're going to have better economics and better environmental outcomes. Now, I mentioned the weather tendency. Out of the Minnesota data, we looked at weather for precipitation from November to June. So really, the precipitation that the fall nitrogen was exposed to and the side dress application was not. So this is really nitrogen losses compared to our side dress applications. And you can see in wet years, there is a big difference between side dress applications and fall applications, almost 10%. Now, in dry years, there really wasn't much difference at all. And so that's one of the things that we need to be aware of moving forward. In Iowa, we have, these are average conditions for Iowa, but in a drier environment, maybe there's not quite as much sensitivity to application timing. But if you're in a rainy climate, you're going to be driving that nitrogen out of the soil and losing it a lot more. So you should be more prepared to apply closer to the growing season. Now, I mentioned some of the challenges that we have with side dress, and here you can see pretty visibly that there are the challenges with taking the equipment through the field. Now, a lot of the time when corn is much more tall than this, you're going to have issues with running over corn or the drag line pulling over the corn, and it can't really rebound from that. And so you're going to have permanent crop damage, and you're not able to side dress apply. Now, we wanted to find a way around that issue, and thank goodness 360 Yield Center came up with the 360 Rain. Now, this is an in-season or an autonomous irrigation system that can drive through the fields and irrigate corn and apply fertilizer, whether it's manure or a synthetic fertilizer or digestate, whatever you want to apply through this, within reason, can be applied. Depending on the version, it can have a 60 to 80 foot wide boom with a 10-foot clearance, so you can irrigate this corn and apply within the corn for the entire growing season. 200 to 250 gallon per minute flow rate. you can irrigate or you can cover about 37 to 50 acres a day, again, depending on the model that you buy. There's root level application. So with the wide drops, you're applying right at the root level rather than a center pivot that would be spraying for the top of the crop. And that's at an advantage for manure application specifically because you don't have to manure over the top of the corn, which can cause some issues. This has been approved for water, nutrients, and manure application, so you have a lot of flexibility with what you can apply. Now, this is a simulation of how it will navigate through the field, that it applies on the outermost Y drops as it's driving out, and then as it's driving back, it puts it down in the middle where the wheels were, so it's not going to be applying, it's not going to have to drive through the wet ground that it covered. Now, a little bit on greenhouse gas abatement with side dress applications or with just improved nitrogen application timing. N2O emissions, which is a pretty significant greenhouse gas, they're based directly on nitrogen application rates. And the GREET model says that it's 1.325% of applied nitrogen for commercial fertilizer. It's a little bit higher for manure, but for the sake of this, we use the same value. Now, because your economic optimum nitrogen rate is decreasing, that means that that reduction in applied nitrogen is also a reduction in nitrous oxide emissions. So we see about a 25% reduction in nitrous oxide, which equates to 0.1 metric tons of CO2e abated per acre. Now, a $30 carbon credit would return about $3 an acre for that. It might cover about a bushel of corn. It's not the best compared to what you see in nitrogen savings and the improved yield in your situation. So by cutting down on your cost to apply nitrogen, or the nitrogen that you're purchasing, and improving your yield, you're going to be returning an extra $39 an acre. Now, I'll touch on this a little bit. Methane emissions from storage are also affected by this nitrogen application timing. By strategically applying your manure in the spring rather than fall, you're controlling when your manure storage is becoming the fullest. So in fall, you're emptying in the fall, of course, and then your manure storage gets full through the summer, and then you apply again in the fall. So now you have the most manure being stored during the hottest temperatures. In comparison, if you apply in the spring or side dress, you empty right before it gets hot. So even though the manure might be warm and it's producing a lot of methane per liter, you're not storing a lot of actual volume of that methane or of the manure. So if you can change that, you can see that there's a 50% reduction in methane emissions and 1 metric tons of CO2e per acre based on the methane emissions reduction, which again equates to a carbon credit of about $34 per acre compared to the nitrous oxide reduction of $3 an acre. Now, a little plug for my poster. I'll have a poster at 5:30 downstairs about methane timing or methane reduction with manure application timing where I can go into more depth about this. So, quick summary. Nitrogen application is key to determining the amount of nitrogen that is actually available to the crop during production. Spring and side dress, just the time that that nitrogen is exposed to weather, and so we're going to be losing less nitrogen in the field. Side dress applications require the lowest nitrogen rate and still have the highest yield. And the 360 rain provides some opportunities for autonomous side dress and split applications that are a bit easier to do, especially being autonomous, than either paying for a commercial application or having to drive out and do it yourself. So in general, you should apply nitrogen as closely as you can to the growing season to minimize end losses, to increase your yield, and to reduce your environmental impacts. Thank you. I'd love to take any questions.